Today, I'm asking the question, what does the Church have to offer women in terms of the plenary council values of inclusivity, participation and synodality? Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the Yagara people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I live. I pay my respects to the elders, past, present and future. In 2020, the Chrism Mass was live-streamed from St Stephen's Cathedral in Brisbane due to the COVID-19 lockdown. In his homily, Archbishop Mark Coleridge waxed lyrical about new models of leadership for the future of the Church. Here's what he had to say.
The question of leadership in the Church is absolutely critical at a time like this. Long before coronavirus descended upon the planet, the Church was facing big questions about the future, and they have only got bigger because of the crisis in which we now find ourselves. We need to ask about the kind of leadership we need in the future and face a few uncomfortable facts. We don't have the numbers of priests we once had. The vocations are few. There are some and we need more, but there is no way we will have the number of ordained priests in a foreseeable future to maintain the current mode of provision. We need new forms of leadership. We will always have the ordained, even though if now there are also questions about the identity of the ordained. But we will need other forms of leadership to be raised up from within the priestly people. New forms of charismatic leadership, gifts of the Holy Spirit, and the oil that we bless is a symbol of the Spirit. We need a new outpouring. We need new forms of charismatic leadership in the Church, forms of leadership perhaps we have never seen or even imagined before, to meet new circumstances and new needs.
I agree. Clearly, we need to be receptive to the Spirit, but we also need to have courage and imagination to think outside the box. But we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are precedents for alternative models of leadership in the Australian Church if only we have the courage and imagination to acknowledge them. One good example is the groundbreaking work that was done in the Townsville diocese in the 1980s and 90s. This work was outlined in the Never Ending Story report. The vision expressed in the document took a decade of community consultation, reflection and endless meetings by the task force. But there were great things happening in the Townsville diocese that led up to the parish restructuring process. Lynn and Len Horner remember those days in Townsville. Before they retired, Lynn was the pastoral leader of the Mundingborough parish, and Len was the Chancellor of the Townsville diocese. Here is how they described the lead-up to the Never Ending Story project.
Lenny Faulkner certainly probably advocated by hiring lay people to do things, like even in my job, I think would have been one of the first places that hired a lay person to be in the diocesan office running they were always priests. A bit of a lay involvement already when Benji came.
So I think he set the groundwork because he had that strong belief in a YCW background, but then in lay ministry, a lot of formation happened in his time.
Benji seemed to run with the vision and was into, because I think Rockhampton was a strong YCW area too, and Benji had been involved in YCW too, so I think he still saw, and we continued that vision. Faulkner had started these assemblies every year, diocesan assembly with all the lay people coming and parishes feeding in.
Pat Fox has spoken enthusiastically about the legacy of Archbishop Faulkner in Adelaide, and Julie Trinidad is exploring the issue further at this conference. But before Faulkner returned to his home state to be Archbishop of Adelaide, he was appointed as Bishop of the Townsville diocese, and that was way back in 1967, in the halcyon days just after Vatican II. While he was in Townsville, Faulkner began a creative process of restructuring the diocese on the principles of Vatican II. Bishop Ray Benjamin followed suit, and the Never Ending Story project arose out of his vision for the diocese. Let's look at some of the ideas that shaped the project. While they were writing the Never Ending Story report, the task force had the usual suspects on their reference shelf. In the documents of Vatican II and the Code of Canon Law, the big idea that inspired the project was the very inclusive image of the people of God, which focuses on the baptismal vocation of all the faithful, who are called to participate in the priestly, prophetic and kingly office of Christ and the mission of the Church. And this is what the task force put forward as a restructuring proposal, that all Christ's faithful share responsibility for the life and mission of the Church. Two other big ideas that shaped the discourse of the report came from the story of the foot washing in John 13, in which Jesus figures as the servant leader and discipleship is interpreted as friendship. Sandra Schneider's article, The Foot Washing, was cited a number of times in the report. Schneider's interprets friendship as equality and mutuality. She wrote this: "What definitively distinguishes the community which Jesus calls into existence from the power structures so universal in human society is the love of friendship expressing itself in joyful mutual service for which rank is irrelevant." Again, in section 5 of the report, the people of God equals the adult partnership model of church leadership, in which participation depends on mutuality, a constant giving and receiving, a willingness to befriend. The basis for participation is not domination or manipulation, but friendship. Let's take a look at a few of the other books that shaped the thinking of the task force. It was good to see 2 Australian sources listed in the bibliography: Dennis Edwards' Call to be Church in Australia and John Thornhill's Sign and Promise. Remember, this was the 80s and 90s, and the task force members were writing their report at more or less the same time as these books were being written, so their thinking was cutting edge. Sign and Promise was cited many times in the report. Here, John Thornhill describes leadership and authority as fostering collaboration, being visionary, recognising and encouraging the talents of others, and facilitating collaboration. There is no place for coercive power in this model. This thinking is reflected in the report when authority is equated with participation, service, and equality. A basic principle in participation is one of service. It is not a service that manipulates and controls, or a service that operates out of inequality. Then these 3 books are about skilling up for collaborative ministry. Among other things, Soffield and Giuliano discuss the importance of vision, but they ask whose vision is shaping the discourse. To ensure that elite groups don't dominate the process, they recommend that everyone who is potentially affected needs to be involved from the beginning. In other words, wide consultation. The Whiteheads talk about partnership as the mutual exchange of gifts. Then Mary Bennett McKinney talks about sharing the wisdom. No one has all the wisdom, but everyone has some. These sources might look like corporate training manuals, but they are all underpinned by the theology and spirituality of Vatican II. In section 6 of the report, there is a plan for formation for all those who are involved in the restructuring process, both lay folks and the ordained. And the 3 books we just saw were some of the sources they used to do this training. These 2 books raise many interesting issues, but they share at least one idea that was central to the Never-Ending Story project: small worshipping communities. Rana predicted in the 70s that the church of the future would be small, made up of intentional Christians. And Dennis Edwards placed great value on the intimacy of face-to-face community for worship. In the wake of the pandemic, it'd be interesting to hear what Dennis would say about our recent online worship experiences. The statement here was in a prominent place in the report. In Townsville, Thuringowa cities, people belong, first and foremost, to a small community. Within this smaller community, people are continually discovering their own identity. It is this small unit that the task force recommends be the basis of the restructuring plan. The task force further recommends that this small unit be called a Catholic community. So the pragmatic amalgamation of parishes, which was beginning to happen around Australia at that time, clearly was not seen as the solution in Townsville. The Indigenous Catholic community on Palm Island was a classic example of how the ideals underpinning small faith communities could work. Mick Peters was parish priest on Palm Island between 83 and 91. He shared some photos of his time there with me. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers are warned that some of the photos may contain images of deceased persons. Here is how Mick described a model of parish that was lived out on Palm Island in the 80s and 90s.
We also tried to work on this sort of model where our parish was seen as towards a self-ministering, self-managing, self-supporting parish community. Now, self-ministering means having its own leaders from within the parish, not coming in from outside. Within the parish, you've got good lay people who are filled with the Holy Spirit and who already on Palm know their people. So train them towards leadership, self-managing so they make decisions themselves, self-supporting. Rather than trying to get money from outside, we try to support ourselves, even financially. So we concentrated on things like shared ministry in service to one another, decisions shared on a local level whenever possible, training for certificate of theology, training people to run the services, elders of the church to co-preside. So it's not just one, but you'd have shared leadership. No emphasis at all on male or female, just whoever they might be, men and women, sharing the leadership. You've got to get away from this whole idea that we as the people are simply helping Father.
Meanwhile, in the restructuring process, 3 models of parish leadership emerged. Mary Lowcock was the coordinator of the Never Ending Story project, and this is how she describes the models in action.
We had 3 types of leadership structures. One was the traditional model of a parish priest. One was a pastoral leader with a priest working in partnership, and one was a team structure. And so we would work with the parish to see what they wanted. We couldn't give them a parish priest because we just didn't have the priests who were suitable to be parish priests. There were a number of priests, like they might be mid-70s to 80s. They didn't want the responsibility. They were quite prepared to work with a pastoral leader who would take on all that administrative responsibility, the pastoral responsibility, and they would be there for some of the pastoral work and for sacramental. So, and those 2 would work together. And if it came to the crunch and a final decision had to be made, it was the pastoral leader. So we never called them pastoral associates, they were pastoral leaders, because that's what they were, leaders in their own right. The third one was the team, and that took a long time to initiate in the parish. We'd work with the parish for 6-8 months on initiating that, because the parish would choose who had to go on the team. So there was usually 4 or 5 people. There was certainly someone for administration, not the parish secretary. The parish secretary would be accountable to that in administration. But
you're talking about paid people, this team?
No,
volunteers. Okay.
There was a pastoral role, so that would be like hospitals, care of the sick. There was a chairperson and there was a priest. The bishop would appoint the priest, but the priest was appointed as a member of the team, not as parish priest. And there were a couple of parishes that chose that team approach. Holy Spirit, Ayr, Halifax was moving towards it. That was sort of like, that was coming into the late 90s that we were able to set up these structures.
Lynn Horner was the pastoral leader for 20 years in the Mundingburra parish in Townsville. This is how she described her role.
We were called pastoral leaders in Townsville. They were pastoral directors in Brisbane. And Michael Putney has struggled with that term because the normal pastoral leader of the parish is the priest. He did want to change the title, but our priest refused to let it go anywhere, so it didn't ever happen.
I asked Lynn how she got started as a pastoral leader.
Well, I was really involved in Mundingburra parish, which was the parish I worked in. We lived on Ross River Road, and I was worked at the school. I was the APRE, so I had a really strong community connection. We got Kev Clancy, and he was getting older, wanted to get out of church administration. He was very happy to stay and do the sacramental side of things, but he had this want to get out of having to run the parish as such. So all this never-ending story was happening in the diocese, and he approached Mary Lowcock and the Pastoral Planning Committee and said he'd like to put his hand up to work in that model. So, and of course the parish came along with the idea. This was under Ray Benjamin, and Ray was really keen. Like, we were even given faculty sheets, but to do baptisms and funerals. And we set up, well, the whole diocese had the pastoral policy, but we had like bereavement teams for preparing funerals and looking after families and that sort of thing. We had baptism teams. I saw that as my role, to facilitate people to use their gifts in the service of the church or the service of the community.
I heard on the grapevine that Bishop Ray Benjamin had commissioned an Aboriginal elder as a wedding celebrant. Alice Bintal, who was until recently the Indigenous Catholic Council Program Manager in Townsville, told me part of the story.
One of our elders had been given a blessing from Bishop Benji to become a celebrant, to marry, and she has married 6 couples from that time. Now we're going back to Bishop Benji's time, 20 years or whatever. She was a very, very prominent elder in the West, Mount Isa. She married the first in 2000.
Later, in a phone conversation, Alice told me that Auntie Colleen Mucken was the elder, and it was Alice's own wedding to her husband Darryl that was first up in 2000. She kindly shared these photos from her wedding album. Mary Lowcock filled in some more details.
Ray Benjamin appointed an Aboriginal woman and put her name down on the list of people that goes to the government and recognised by the Queensland government. So she had her ticket or whatever you have to be a wedding celebrant. Yeah.
Well,
now, after he did it, he then wrote to Rome and said, "This is what I've done." Never heard back.
He never heard back? Well, what a surprise. Clearly, in the Indigenous community, elders, as liturgical leaders, had a lot of authority, which they shared with priests. Similarly for pastoral leaders like Lynn Horner.
So it was in conjunction with the priests, so people knew that they were there.
So it was co-responsibility, yeah.
But it was also made very clear by the bishop installing the leader and make it very clear that now Lynn is responsible to me for this parish.
Yeah, so we were never responsible. I was never responsible to the priest. I was responsible to the bishop, and so was he.
I asked Lynn how many pastoral leaders were women.
There had been religious sisters, so I was the first lay woman as such. All women except for Bill Coolborough on Palm.
Bill Coolborough was a Vietnam War hero and a well-respected elder on Palm Island. He was also pastoral leader of the parish for 9 years. This is how Mick Peters describes those times.
I said, Bill, I'd like to send a group of our elders, and especially you and Edna, up to Nungalinyu College. Now that's an Aboriginal Theological College in Darwin. So we sent, I think it was 8 of them after 12 months, and they all come back with their certificate of theology. But before we sent them, we made it clear that when they come back, the whole study is not just for them. They're coming back so that they can serve their people. I said, when you come back, I want you to slowly but surely take over the running of the parish. So Bill and the elders began taking over the running of the church, and I was sort of stepping back.
Mick was on Palm for 9 years. In 1991, he left the island.
6 months before I left, Bishop Ray Benjamin came over to Palm and had a meeting with the parishioners. He explained to them that I was leaving and that he had no priest to replace me. Ray was pretty smart, because if you send any priest over who just takes control, all the work that we'd done would be gone, finished. So he knew what was happening over there, the involvement of the church elders. So he told them there'd be no priest available, but they'd need to run the church themselves. He said to the parishioners, what do you suggest? And they all said, well, there's a group of elders, we'll get them to run the church. And he said, I'm very happy with that. You can do all the baptisms, the funerals, and all that. He said to them, I'm happy about the church elders taking over, but he said, I really need one of them to be the contact person. They all pointed to Bill. And he said, well, I'd like to make Bill the pastor of the parish, the lay pastor. So when I moved out of the presbytery, Bill and his wife moved in. And together with the elders, they ran the church for the next 9 years. So it worked well. Now when he stepped down, we appointed Gertie the pastor. But shortly after that, Ray Benjamin retired. Michael Putney came. He almost immediately sent a Filipino priest to Palm Island. Some Filipino priests, okay, but this man was quite conservative. So he took over. And Aboriginal leaders of church, if they see that happening, they step back and they step right out. So within 6 months or so, that was the end of all the leadership.
In Ray Benjamin's time, the Church of St Teresa's was given to the Catholic Indigenous community as a parish church and community centre, and a group of elders were sent up to the Wantop College in Cairns to prepare them for leadership in the community. Auntie Gladys Saylor was one of that group. The elders made some creative cultural adaptations to the liturgy over the years. This is how Auntie Gladys described a baptism.
Not only with the water but with the oil, but we light our little fire and warm the baby's arms and legs, mouth, ears, eyes. So they rub them down with oil and squeeze their joints and we warm them then.
Mick Peters explained how traditional Aboriginal cultural practices became part of the baptismal liturgy for the Indigenous community.
That's just a picture of a wonderful man, Arthur Peterson, a very cultural man who knew Aboriginal spirituality, who they introduced on Palm in our baptismal ceremony a little dancing around the fire. In Aboriginal culture, when a little baby's born, they light a fire and they warm their hands on the fire. The elders warm their own hands and then they touch with those warmed hands the parts of the body of the little baby. May God bless your eyes. May you see good things. May God bless your mouth. And it's a little bit like a baptism ceremony in the Western Church. So we introduced that, but people like Arthur, filled with their spirituality, were able to give guidance on all that.
In his time on Palm Island, Mick put a lot of effort into training the elders for liturgical leadership. You've seen this photograph before, but Mick used it to describe his nuts and bolts method of ministry training.
And that's an example of what we tried to do. Is when you don't have a priest, you have 3 elders leading the service. That'll be leader 1 in the middle, leader 2, leader 3. They all play different parts in the service, and I looked it up so they knew their role. Liturgy of the Word with communion. So what we used to do, whether it was a funeral or a baptism, or the elders or the leaders would go up to the church together with me, just any day of the week, and we'd have what they called a dry run. So if it was a funeral, we'd put the stool there and pretend the coffin was there, and get one of the elders to lead the start and then somebody to give the homily. We'd be just sitting there listening, and they'd be doing it as though it was a real thing. So the whole idea was learning by doing, rather than learning in a classroom. And I found that for adults it was a good thing.
Lynn Horner also described the importance of ministry training in diocesan pastoral planning. She especially noted the work of liturgy consultants Ursula O'Rourke and Erica Marshall, who worked in the diocese during the 80s and 90s.
I've always loved liturgy, and I was very lucky to have Ursula and Erica. Anything I learned about liturgy really came from them. So we had a whole ministry with lay people trained and everything to do funerals. And started with Ursula, but mainly with Erica. And Ursula's a wonderful pastoral liturgist. Like, I've never met anybody who was good at working with parish people like she is. She can get all that theory and down to the average person's level, and they love her. We've always blessed in Townsville that we've had a liturgy person who worked for the diocese. So I probably was good at knowing what people's gifts were, and then inviting them to do that. And then we'd set up a training program. Erica especially ran a very good, fairly formal preparation program for baptism teams that some of the team that I had still, would say today it was the best thing they'd ever done. We tried to do formation every year for our teams and for people in readers and all that sort of thing. But the diocese had good pastoral planning, and a lot of that you could get expert people in to do those jobs.
Most of what I recorded here focused on the last century. Lots has changed since then. There's a problem everywhere with the failure of leadership succession. Alice described what's happening in the Catholic Indigenous community.
We've got elders now that are slowly dying off, and we have a big gap now where we don't have anybody to step up.
There are still lots of women active in our parishes, but they're not getting any younger. Sometimes I wonder if we've missed the boat. Has the Plenary Council come too late for women's leadership in the Church? We can't afford to let this opportunity pass us by without a courageous and imaginative, practical response. Let's take a leaf out of Townsville's book and start thinking outside the box before it's all too late to do anything about inclusivity, participation and synodality. Thanks for listening.